This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. Before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by HubSpot. With HubSpot, marketing has never been easier. Create content fast, get better leads, and nail your reporting all in one place. Visit HubSpot.com/marketers to see how companies like yours are generating 110% more leads in just 12 months. G'day, I'm Kate Watson. Alastair MacGibbon is someone whose name you'll see pop up in the news from time to time, and I expect increasingly so. The reason being, he is Australia's foremost cyber security expert. His CV is long, but it's important. It reads, former National Cybersecurity Advisor, head of the Australian Cyber Security Centre, and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Cybersecurity. Prior to these appointments, he served as the Australian Government's inaugural eSafety Commissioner. He headed eBay's Asia Pacific Trust and Safety operations, and he held several corporate advisory roles in cybersecurity. Before that, Alastair served as a federal agent with the Australian Federal Police for 15 years, during which time he established the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre. Now, Alastair runs the world-leading cybersecurity company, CyberCX. Long story short, when it comes to cyber threats in Australia, Alastair is the guy in the know. Fair warning, this interview tackles some big themes: cyber warfare, online criminal threats, how exposed our critical infrastructure could be to malicious actors. Alastair tells me that the threats to our nation, if we fail in securing ourselves, are very real and obvious. He also explains, and this is where he is very relevant to this Newsmaker series, that the most critical piece of critical infrastructure we have is not a power station or a water station or a telecommunications company. It's our parliaments and our courts and the free press. Alastair, thank you for joining us. I think in order to understand where you're coming from in this conversation, we need to understand a little about what CyberCX does. I confess, I did try and read your recent cyber threats report. And
Did you like it?
The summary was excellent. And then I barely understood the rest. And I thought, wow, there's a lot going on here that the layman just doesn't understand.
No, and frankly, nor should they have to, right?
Yeah.
They should care about consequences, and tech people should design technology such that it's fit for purpose. If you bought a microwave or a baby pram stroller that cut your fingers off every time you fold it up, they'd take that off the market, right? They'd say it wasn't fit for purpose. Maybe it rolls a baby around, but hey, it damages things more broadly. We do that for every piece of consumer good and service except for tech. And with tech, we've kind of accepted that it's all just failed and that, unless you use it right, we're just going to let you get harmed. And so what we do is we try to design out the harm piece. Julian McGrath, the eSafety Commissioner after me, and the current one, talks about this safety by design. What's needed is safety by design and security by design in tech products. That's what we do. So we're about 1,400 people, engineers and consultants. So some people less technical, but they look at the business question. What's the outcome you need? And then we look to engineer whatever that outcome is.
Can you give me an example? What's a good example of like a business you would work with or a client you would work with? I mean, I assume a lot of it you can't actually say.
Well, no, we work with corporates and governments. We're largely Australia, New Zealand, I should say, but increasingly in the Pacific and Asia. And we have people in the US and the UK as we grow out there. Mm-hmm. And we're weirdly an Australian, New Zealand success story. Most people don't think of Australians being good at tech, and they certainly don't see them as being dominant in cybersecurity. But we are now. Like we're one of the world's biggest pure play professional services firms in cybersecurity. Again, that rolls off the tongue, right? And clearly makes you hugely popular at parties. So an example, a critical infrastructure organisation, let's call them electricity generator, a power station might want to secure their IT and their OT. The OT is the operational technology, the on-off switches that are electronic these days inside, that big power generation place. We will come in and secure that. We'll secure it in terms of how they architect their technologies. We'll test.
So if it went out, you could still open the door that needs to be opened or flick the switch that needs to be flicked?
More so we would look to sort of see that they've got everything sort of strung together so that the security technologies they've bought work as best they can. We will, from time to time, actually be the people 24/7 monitoring for any anomalous activity. Should there be an incident, we'll send in incident responders. So it's really hard to say. So, for example, some of the biggest hacks and breaches you've seen in the press, that'll be our team. So whether it's DP World, the ports where 40% of containerised cargo last Christmas before last, was potentially held up because of a ransomware incident, that'd be our team. We're the ones that have responded to a whole range of really big things, whether it's hospitals, public hospitals and private hospitals taken offline by criminals. That'll be us that go in. Same with, say, some big health insurers and others. We'll be the teams that respond.
Right.
And we now do that on behalf of the Australian government in the Pacific as well. So we'll go and help neighbours out who've had critical infrastructure impacted. Most of what we try to do is prevent bad things happening. So we've got several hundred clients where 24/7 our teams are monitoring for anomalous behaviour inside their networks, whether they're pieces of critical infrastructure. Think ports, airports, electricity generators and transmitters, some government departments, some small banks, a lot of other corporates. We'll do that.
Okay, so that's the...
Does that help?
It really helps. I think the thing I've learned in researching this is this critical infrastructure phrase is going to be used a lot. So what is critical infrastructure? And when we talk about that, we are talking about things that help the country operate. So you are focusing on that, less so small businesses, scams, individuals. Sounds like a big responsibility.
Absolutely it is. So we've got, as I said, several hundred entities, and a lot of them are critical infrastructure that will 24/7 protect online, guard. And that is a hugely responsible situation to find ourselves. And one of the reasons for setting up this business, why I left government the second time, I think it was only twice I've ever left government, was because I wanted to build something to cover parts that I always thought government should do, but had difficulty scaling to itself and couldn't be agile if it did, right? So I had big budgets when I was in government. But what I couldn't do is provide services at scale.
I'm just trying to think about it, but come at it from like if you're someone like me, a voter, you're considering these big things that we're going to talk about in a minute, but is your expectation naturally that the government would do the job of cyber CX? Or
bits of it, yes, weirdly.
Yeah.
And that sounds very self-defeating to suggest that. But yes, I'm a police officer at heart, right?
Yeah.
If these crimes were occurring offline, there would be people rioting in the street. Where is the government to protect us? The number one crime affecting households in Australia is now a cybercrime. The number one crime impacting small businesses in Australia is a cybercrime. The number one crime impacting corporates, and on it goes, right? And yet our response to date has been one of not scaling, not moving in at the pace that society frankly expects. I'm going to make a prediction for you. This will become a voting issue amongst the top voting issues in state and Commonwealth elections. Here's why. A premier is essentially elected these days on whether or not they can convince the population of their state that they can do education, health, transport and safety in a better way, in a more efficient way or a more wholesome way than whoever is opposing them. With cybercrime being the number one crime, that becomes a voting issue statewide. What are you doing to protect me? When I make a complaint to the police, do they take that complaint? Do they do anything with it, or do they just tell me I was stupid being online? When I started in this space, and you went to a local police station, the cops would ask why you were doing online banking, right? I mean, that's how bad it was. I mean, you almost deserve to be a victim, and that's terrible. Now, that's not what happens today with policing.
Shifted.
But there's not a lot of resolution for the public. And from a Commonwealth point of view, given its main job is to protect the public from in a national security sense, right? It's the number one job. The number one national security threat to Australia, and I say this as someone that also cares a lot about what happens offline in terms of national security threats. The number one national security threat is an online-based one, whether that's an effect on our democracy through mis and disinformation, critical infrastructure through the concept of impeding the functioning of devices that are so critical to how our society functions, banking, electricity, water, supermarkets, all that stuff is all connected to the number one crime against individuals being a cyber one. It has to become a voting issue, and it will.
And you said, I was actually going to ask you about this because just to put this in context, I get the sense from the work you do and the way that what you write, what you've written, that this is the thing you're most concerned about is our national security when it comes to cyber threats. And I think for people listening, we talk a lot about China and we talk a lot about Russia, but actually getting into the nub of what the problem here is where I want to go with you. You actually said, I think it was a 60 Minutes episode a few years ago, that when technology fails, the way we've set up our technology, people will die and economies will tip. And you said that was a matter of when, not if. You better explain that big call to people, because I think it sets up the whole conversation and basically is the motivator for what you do.
It is a big call. And I'll be right, sadly. It is, for your listeners, only a matter of time before a catastrophic event occurs involving a malicious actor and connected technologies that leads to death and massive social disruption.
How does that play out? Can you give me a case study?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a non-malicious event that will illustrate, I think, if you then sort of think about what a malicious actor could do. So back last year, there's a company called CrowdStrike, really legitimate cyber security company. They produce essentially a piece of technology that sits on the endpoints of computers. They're one of, the top cyber technology companies. They updated their Microsoft endpoints. Who cares, right? I
think people will remember this.
You might even have CrowdStrike working on your endpoint there. No one knows, right? It's just not a name. It's not a consumer name. When they pushed this update, I happened to be in London at the time. It affected, because they updated just the Microsoft one rather than the Apple one, it affected 1% of all Microsoft endpoints in the world, almost instantaneously. That's laptops, but it's also servers. And it started crippling things like airlines. There were banks that couldn't function. There were big supermarket chains that couldn't.
I think anyone at Coles, you couldn't check out. You couldn't.
You couldn't get into a hotel. Depending on the hotel, you couldn't get issued even. You couldn't. Not only could you not pay, but you couldn't be issued a card to get into your room. Airlines weren't functioning. Some airports were affected because they sell themselves to critical infrastructure. Now, that was a non-malicious act.
So, sorry, this is an example of a non-malicious.
This is a non-malicious act, and yet it was one of the great wake-up calls for people. Imagine if you had a nation-state threat actor or a criminal, and we'll get onto criminals and nation-states, I hope, because they each have a slightly different motivation and a different risk appetite. But imagine if they said, I'm not going to affect us 1%. I'm going to go 10, 20, 30% of those Microsoft things. And imagine if the fix wasn't as simple as literally turning the computer off and back on again and doing a couple of, you had to physically get to each of those devices, and some of those were quite remote. So that meant teams worked really aggressively to get things back up and going. But there was no offender trying to stop you do it. And the trouble with critical infrastructure is not the individual institutions. You cannot have water if you don't have electricity or telephony. You can't. You can't have electricity if you don't have telephony and water, right? And on this goes, this interconnected nature of everything, which means in extremis, and it will happen, a malignant threat actor will shut down enough parts of the economy and society that the other parts stop functioning too.
So when you say a nation state or a malicious actor, are we talking, is this cyber warfare? Is that where we're at? What are the steps here?
I'm very conscious that my friends inside the Department of Defence and some of the intelligence agencies will say, here you are talking about cyber warfare again. I'm going to start by saying yes, just to help them out here, just to get their blood pressure up. Absolutely. Is cyber warfare a thing? Yes. Are the things happening now? Look, put it this way, the main nation-state threat actors we face in Australia and our region, in order, are China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. You could take those, the second, third and fourth, and flip them around occasionally depending on what it is. But they're the top four. Then you've got a whole range of regional actors who do what they're meant to do, right? If some of these acts, so China was accused last year of a thing called Volt Typhoon. And Volt Typhoon was the US government in particular, but other Western governments, including Australia, came out saying China pre-positioning inside critical infrastructure, electronically, inside critical infrastructure, not for the purposes of spying, the world's second oldest profession, not for the purposes of spying and espionage, but for the purposes of destruction to impede the functionality of that critical infrastructure in a time of heightened conflict. Now, let's then create the offline example.
I feel like you need
that.
to say that sentence again, because that is like the nub of it. It's this at a time of conflict, they would already have embedded. So
yes.
Is Huawei a good example? Is this a good time to use that example of why we actually blocked Huawei?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. 2018, the last decision, national security decision of the Turnbull government, was to block high-risk vendors from being in the 5G network rollout in Australia. There's a couple of really interesting things. Some people would argue that was because of espionage. I would say having been someone involved at the time, I'll be a bit cautious, but it wasn't about espionage. It was actually about the concept of China being able to turn off 5G systems.
Which is what you're sort of saying, is this ability to be connected in the infrastructure.
Well, in this case, you were buying infrastructure, technical infrastructure from a state that doesn't have your interests at heart, has to have telemetry going between that device and the manufacturer, in this case a Chinese company, where if it pushed an update, that literally a software update. So if you think about a connected device, it has to be updated by the manufacturer, in this case a Chinese-based company. What if the update was just to brick the device and stop it functioning? Imagine what that would do to telephony, and not just consumer telephony, but industrial concept of connectivity. That's why that decision was made. It was actually, but that's not the same as Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon is actually a very subtle, what they call living off the land. Let's get a little bit slightly technical. I'll get right to the edge of my technical skill set here. This is where you're not using a slightly more obvious command and control infrastructure or malicious code being inserted inside this critical infrastructure. It's where they will somehow steal your account or my account if I worked in that entity, and they'll slowly work out how to maneuver using very slightly divergent actions such that they're so quiet it's hard to find them, and they will slowly escalate their privileges and put themselves in a situation where this living off the land means you're not trying to find. Sometimes we'll go in and you just find the code that the offender, nation state or criminal, has put in this case, so subtle that they are using the tools you have inside the organisation to carry out their acts. Very subtle. And as I said, this had the West turning around saying this is just designed for the purposes of crippling critical infrastructure. If you found a Chinese commando team coming in and putting plastic explosives on telephone exchanges and inside, power generation plants, with a remote
physically
control, doing it,
yeah.
A remote control that says, if we need to, we're going to blow up this plant and this telecommunications company, that'd be an act of war, 100% an act of war, which is why I say this is cyber warfare. Absolutely. Because when a nation state then does that to you, just because they're not wearing camouflaged, uniforms and rowing at night and attaching this explosive device, which is what we always expect to see, and that's war. These were technical teams sitting in China. Some of them were private sector technical teams, by the way, in China, putting the equivalent of an explosive device on critical infrastructure.
So who discovered Volt Typhoon?
Microsoft and the US government.
Right.
And
then do we work with them? Do they – because, it's interesting, just the topic of conversation now is our security is secured a lot by the US, and there's a lot of changes happening in and around the leadership of the United States and the way they're thinking about all of these things. And we've talked at length on this podcast about, the Trump sort of like inverting on itself and the US closing itself in and just looking after the US. A lot of worry from a lot of people that how that's going to impact us. I assume a cooperative arrangement with the US is vital to interrupting these things and realising these things,
yes,
or perhaps not.
So in this case, this was led by Microsoft and the US government. They were the ones that you put out then what are called TTPs, which are essentially the roadmap on how to find it. And inside the cybersecurity community, there's a lot of cooperation between organisations when they find a new way of someone doing something bad is you'll publish this roadmap and say, here's what you need to look for, this type of software, this IP address, this type of manoeuvring inside. And then what you do as a defender is you go in and look for those activities and go, can I see the same thing across my thousands of clients, which is what we went to do. Now, I mentioned this in particular was living off the land. Very hard because by its nature, it's so subtle that it's a legitimate account doing things that are slightly different. So everyone's been very tight-lipped about what has been found in terms of Volt Typhoon. You combine that then with the CrowdStrike example, which was not malicious, and they're a great company and it was an accident.
Yeah.
And you shut down a certain percentage of the world. 1% of Microsoft computers makes the world go a bit quiet for a while. Imagine a nation state doing something similar with malicious intent across double digits of those computers. That's the potential.
A message now from HubSpot. When all your marketing team does is put out fires, you burn out fast. But with Breeze, HubSpot's suite of AI tools, you can get results without the stress. It means you can capture audience attention, access all your data from one place, and see how easy it is to get 110% more leads in just 12 months. Visit HubSpot.com/marketers to learn more. What I constantly get with the national security issue, you'd say to people, for example, China's listening to you, right? China's listening on your device. There's the conversation around TikTok. And people say, I don't really mind. Like, why does it matter if Xi Jinping knows what I'm up to? I don't care. What do you say to people when they say that? Because I think we need to help people understand, the difference between what governments are dealing with at this level and what CyberCX is dealing with and what they're actually doing.
Yes.
And why that matters.
Okay. So China is the world's largest surveillance state, right? The Chinese Communist Party is scared of a whole range of people, particularly their five poisons, right? So they'll always collect on Uyghurs and pro-democracy activists and, pro-Hong Kong independence people. They're always going to do that. Anyone who's a critic of their regime. So the average person might sit there and go, well, I'm not. I just use TikTok or a Hikvision camera or
whatever it is. Right. I bought an EV or what, yeah.
Like all my answers, there's a couple of layers to this. Firstly, I'd say people misunderstand just what type of kleptomaniacs you're dealing with. They will steal everything they can and look to use it at some later stage. So if they know about you, they know about your biometrics. So DeepSeek was in the press a couple of weeks ago. One of the things DeepSeek did, which is a Chinese AI platform that claimed to be, super cheap and better than the Western versions. One of the things they collected was essentially the biometrics of the way you typed. And people would sit there and go, who cares? They actually said it in their terms and conditions, by the way, which I thought was surprisingly open of them. I care. Because the way I type, the way I use a keyboard then becomes an identifier for me on a whole range of other platforms, right? Hikvision cameras all over the place capturing imagery of often benign and irrelevant things to a person sitting in Australia could be really important to the Chinese Ministry of State Security. Who are you meeting? How often are you meeting with them? If you're in the political class and you're now at a cafe that isn't in Parliament House but somewhere else, because remember, these cameras were taken out of Parliament House, but they're not taken out of the cafe or your front of your house or in a rail station or somewhere. This camera captures who you're dealing with and gets sucked into the world's largest surveillance state. Do people not wonder what at some future date a totalitarian regime, which is expansionist by nature and doesn't have our best interests at heart, could do with that information? So I understand if the average punter doesn't care about that individually, but I then care about connected technologies more broadly. I really don't care if TikTok stops functioning. In fact, we'll probably be a better society if we all spend a bit less time getting sucked down those little rabbit holes. But what about all these other connected devices we've got, whether it's surveillance cameras that we rely upon, whether it's Chinese-made cars that are connected by their nature.
Well, you said we're effectively sleepwalking into a world where demonstrably unsafe Chinese products are flooding the Australian market.
Yeah, so let me build on that. The solar inverters on people's roofs, and we have the highest solar uptake in the world. The battery technologies that electricity is going to, that helps now make our grid both at the one hand, one of the most renewable in the world and therefore one of the most unstable in the world, 90+% Chinese technologies. Now, go back to my point before about whether or not someone decides to upgrade a 5G connection to just stop it functioning. Imagine if you suddenly stopped all of that solar stuff from working, or you've plugged in a Chinese EV to the grid and you turn off the safety feature that says when the battery is charged, stop charging. And instead, and this might sound extreme to your listeners, the car blows up. Or what if instead of charging those batteries when they get connected to the network, you just tell it, everyone dump all their power right now into the grid all at once. Or all those batteries do something funky. Or the smart meters.
Which is what happened in Lebanon, right?
Well, so this is interesting. So supply chain attack done by the Israelis. Yeah, so all you do is you combine a Volt Typhoon with a CrowdStrike benign incident with an Israeli amazing act of sabotage of a supply chain, combine it with a country that has amongst the world's most amount of connected technologies, which is Australia, and start asking yourself what ifs.
And is it that sophisticated already?
Absolutely,
all of
it
this
is.
is possible.
The intent is certainly there by China. That's demonstrated by Volt Typhoon. This is not some weird event that's going to happen and everyone go, oh my God, who would have ever thought this will happen? The reality is we know it will. So then you've got to start asking the question of low likelihood, high consequence events occurring. And what is our public policy that goes around that? Sure, I'm not suggesting it's going to happen every day, but it will happen. So how do we stop this catastrophic event from having such impact? You're not going to stop it occurring. The whole idea when you talk about this type of risk management is how do I stop it being as catastrophic?
And are we doing a good job of that in your opinion?
I would say amongst Western nations, Australia is doing as much around critical infrastructure as anyone else, whether it's the Brits or the Americans or other sort of countries we would often look to, or the Singaporeans even, right? So we have critical infrastructure legislation and there's a regulator or a series of regulators, but it's slow. And I'm not being critical of those public servants, by the way. The fact that they're doing anything is quite remarkable because it's too easy in this laissez-faire world of technology just to go, yeah, it's all too hard, it's all too big, it's all too nebulous, and will it ever happen? So there's an element there where I think what we're doing is amazing. At the same time, it's way too slow and it won't stop these catastrophic events that will happen.
And what's your message to individuals? What can we do anything?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of really tangible things. So when you're buying a piece of connected technology, a so-called smart device, just like, and this is going to sound like a crazy example, so I apologise. You know me well enough to know I'll come up with some crazy examples. When I go to the supermarket, I don't always buy the cheapest cut of meat, right? To me, value is different to price. So I will buy sometimes a more expensive item because I know where it's produced or, you know, what went into it to make it this item that I'm about to consume. The same logic should apply with technology. So why is it that the connected devices that everyone are buying are these cheap Chinese-made devices that by their nature have to have telemetry going back to China and software updates from China, leading to this example of, you know, some catastrophic shutting down of critical infrastructure and damaging our very society? That's now a consumer decision. 2018, Malcolm Turnbull and the National Security Committee make a decision, tell 3 telcos, you just can't have this high-risk vendor or vendors inside your network. Job done. Fast forward 6 years and it's no longer a decision by government. It's a consumer decision made at the checkout at electronic stores and supermarkets and online all day. So
should there be like public health campaigns? Because I mean, one of the specific companies I wanted to ask you about, we touched on TikTok, but we've done a lot of talking on this show about Temu and Shein and online shopping and shopping those sites from China. Can people make better decisions around that stuff?
Yes.
And do you think then the government has a role to play in educating?
I think they do. The concept of buying on those online, so those e-commerce platforms, essentially, there's a whole range of other reasons, environmental and social, slave labour and other things people should definitely be thinking about, there's no doubt. I mean, having forced labour build some of this stuff, you need to ask yourself
some ethical questions
where your
about
ethics
that.
are, absolutely. But I don't think that's going to solve the problem because the problem is also when businesses make these decisions. So we're asked a lot by clients, what about these connected technologies? What should we do? Now, again, we're dealing with the bigger end of town, okay, thousands of clients, but you know, in a country with millions of businesses, they'll ask us things like, are those connected cameras a potential threat to us? You know, is this piece of operational technology manufactured in China not as good as a European one. So they can make those decisions not just on price. So the consumer bit's really fascinating. We did a piece on a doorbell that was hacked recently. It was a super cheap Chinese doorbell. It was just poorly constructed. It was hacked, and the offender had the feed of this household's driveway and front door for a fair while. And most interestingly, it was used as a pivot point to attack other computers inside the house, one of which was a corporate computer, which is how we were alerted, because our client says one of our computers is being attacked.
Yeah.
And it was all because of this. They shared the same Wi-Fi and on it goes. So could individual consumer decisions help? Yes. They're not going to turn the ship around. Turning the ship around is going to have to start being, and this is where I get a bit more controversial, so I apologise. We shouldn't see the world as being one free open internet. Those days are gone, right? We think about an Arab Spring and look at that, democracy flourishes, and then you find those countries can easily block the internet and stop their public being able to use social media. So, big red cross there. China's proven with the Great Firewall of China, it can stop most of these evil, liberal, Western democratic ideas getting to China, but they can spew their thoughts.
Which is exactly where I wanted to go, because we're a news business. This idea of information and the way information's disseminated is super fascinating, in the sense of it might not be so much that they can then blow up your doorbell. I know that wasn't the example, but the example you used before, but more that they can influence the way we think about things.
Yes.
And how involved do you get in that part
Well, the
of
most
it?
critical piece of critical infrastructure we have, and you've worked for politicians, as have I. I've worked with them and for them. The most critical piece of critical infrastructure we have in this country is not a power station or a water station or a telecommunications company. It's our parliaments and our courts and, frankly, the free press, right? It is democracy. And the number one threat to our democracy, and by that I mean those institutions around as well, as I say courts and the media and the like, is mis and disinformation. Number one, with a bullet, 100%. And the way, and you are a media source that wouldn't have existed in the past, and you can't unscramble the egg of what's happened to the media in this country, and you may not want to as well, right? But the way people get their information now is fundamentally different. It's largely via social platforms. It's largely driven by an algorithm that most people don't understand, and each one of those has a different algorithm. And that's the main threat, by the way, of a TikTok. It's not information being sucked in about whether you like a particular type of cat or type of dance. It's the fact that social discourse also happens via those platforms. In fact, the number one way in which young people are getting their news is on an Instagram and a TikTok and other things. So that does then lead to responsibilities by those platforms. And I still, and this is going to sound really harsh, and again, I'm sure there'll be lots of people that criticise it because I've said it before, is frankly, they're publishers. All right. If their algorithm determines what you see, and it's not just like a library where you walk in and you select a book off the shelf like the old days, they curate that library and they feed you information via an algorithm. They're publishers, and they should have responsibilities of publishers for content and truth in that content.
And so, like, an example of that might be, this is where I'm keen for you to correct me if I'm wrong, but an example of that might be there might be someone they want elected in a certain seat in Parliament, and what we know these social media companies can do is specifically target that population with certain types of content that means that they might be more than likely to vote for that certain person and have that person elected to Parliament and then influence Parliament. Like, it's quite subtle.
Yes, and there's two components to this. One, if people might recall the Cambridge Analytica matter, where Facebook would sell information about individual users, right down to, to your point, this is not... Often when people think about mis and disinformation campaigns, they sort of think about national level sort of fake news, when really the subtlety in this might be a handful of electors in a handful of seats that fundamentally changes the outcome of an election. Absolutely. And it is so hard. I often call it soft tissue damage because you can't see it on an X-ray, and it can be so low level and so subtle that looks like an open and free election, but you've just targeted 100 people in a swing seat with a little piece of information, largely in a little group that is an echo chamber in itself, and that could cause as much harm as a national level piece of garbage campaign that most people realise is fake, the second it's happened. And you've seen some examples around the world of where they've tried these national level sort of fakeries, but mostly my fear is the subtle stuff. What happens if you just target a group of people? What if, you found in the US, what if you took the black population and told them that, all the really nasty things being done there and amplify it, and then you got some sort of neo-Nazi right-wing group and told them something different was happening, and you got them to meet in the same spot and you start a fight, right? I mean, we know that happened in America. We know that they've tried doing that in other countries too, whether it's the Russians and I would argue China as well, North Korea, Iran, perhaps a near neighbour that doesn't want us to be so successful. Those things will happen.
So could that be happening right now and we don't know?
Absolutely. Western social media companies will sell that data to you to advertise, right? So malicious advertising is a thing. What's the difference between malicious advertising, trying to get you to go to a malicious website through malvertising, as they call it? One of the things you learn about cyber is you always create a new name.
Yeah, I was going to say malvertising.
You always create a new name for something that offline you can give a sensible answer to. That's the cyber world always. And just when people start understanding it, they create a new phrase to keep themselves employed. But yeah, why wouldn't you do that right now? Is it happening in this country? I'm going to assure you it is. Because why wouldn't you? If you're a nation state, frankly, or a criminal, some crazy criminal group.
And this, tell me about that. Like, talk to me about, because the difference, like what's the craziest, wildest criminal situation we have happening online?
Oh, okay. Well, this concept of data theft extortion, where criminals will steal information, and if you recall the Medibank example, where the criminals created lists of people with different things like terminated pregnancies, another list of people who had drug addiction, some people with suicidal ideation. Here's a group of people that have claimed or been somehow connected to Medibank in order for that to occur. That is really malignant. Imagine a criminal who does that but then targets the individuals, contacts individuals whose data has been stolen and saying, whoever was the custodian of this isn't paying us, but you can pay me, Kate, $50 not to have your information released.
To not be on the list.
And that does happen. We see that happening. Right, that's so bizarre. That's very malignant. That's your personal information being misused and weaponised against you at a consumer level. We've seen families of executives in organisations that are being ransomed by these criminals, held extorted by these criminals, being contacted, hey, get your dad to call us. By the way, we know where you live. I mean, that's pretty scary stuff, and that does occur. So that just shows you how malignant these criminal groups are. There is no doubt, the biggest crime actually happening against small businesses now, and it's devastating financially, is what we call business email compromise. You'll see that in the report that you said was so hard to read. Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars lost to small business in what is essentially just changing the beneficiary details in invoices, right? It's a false invoicing crime. And it doesn't sound very sexy, but if you do that across hundreds of thousands of small businesses and they're losing, 10, 20, 30, maybe a couple of $100,000 each time, that is a devastating crime, shutting down small businesses during a cost of living crisis, right? That stuff matters, let alone what offenders will do online in terms of child sex offending and the like, which is just completely foul. Again, a really fast-growing crime, and one that has led to the death of people is the abuse of intimate images, whether it's a consensual relationship where people have shared images with each other, which I would strongly urge people not to, where either the former partner has shared it or machines are compromised and that those images are then accessible by criminals. The fastest-growing crime against young men at the moment is them meeting someone online who shows affection towards them and, maybe shares supposedly an image of themselves naked and gets the young man in particular to share an image, and then they threaten to contact everyone on Facebook and Instagram or whatever other.
And are most of these criminals living amongst us, or are these offshore? Are they in other countries? What?
That's a really great question, Kate. The vast bulk of crime happens from offshore. There's no doubt. And these are and why? Low barrier to entry, high rewards and low consequences, particularly if you're outside the jurisdiction. But I'm not going to let Australians off the hook here. We know there are some particularly malignant people that live and work amongst us, often young men who I call chaos agents who do these types of crimes. And they've done some of those big data leak, data spill type hacks, and they commit some of these crimes against individual people that have led to harm, self-harm and death. And those people should be caught by Australian police and prosecuted to the maximum extent possible, because they are, as I say, they're chaos agents. They have no EQ. They have absolutely zero regard for the harm they cause, and yet they get the benefits of this society. Weirdly, I understand overseas criminals more. Most of those have come from, in the case of the former Soviet Union for the hacking type stuff, and a lot of the scams were in West Africa and Asia. And I kind of get that in a weird way. I don't like it, and we need to move against it. Those big, you might have heard of these, pig butchering and pig fattening facilities that are now sort of up in that sort of Golden Triangle area, across from Thailand and the like, where, again, I don't condone it, but I kind of understand historically why they're there. These are lawless areas. They're areas where Western money is outsized in its benefit, and they're hugely profitable, those scam centres. I find it easier for me to comprehend them than I do someone inside Australia causing that type of harm.
So I guess just to round this all out, what are you, because you're so active in this space, and I can tell it's so much more than like a company you've set up. Like this is, you desperately want people to understand the issue here. What would you like to, if there was one thing you'd like the government to do better, what would that be? I think particularly with regards to national security.
Wow. I was asked the other day by a senior official, like, if we went to war, it's such a hard answer. Australia needs to build up its cyber war fighters, there's no doubt. That means you need more cyber professionals inside the Australian military. We need stronger intelligence agencies. I'm sure that's popular with the taxpayer, right? But it's necessary. And they will never get to the levels necessary, right? They just can't. It's just a maths problem. Where do you find those people? How do you recruit them and train them? So how do you work more effectively with the private sector? And then, by the way, if they're off fighting a war, who's protecting the banks and electricity transmitters and generators and the telcos and other things that will be attacked by the enemy in the case of war? And we've never really properly mapped that out as a country. If you go to war today, it's a fundamentally different environment than it would have been in the last major war that we were involved in that potentially affected domestic Australia. Not the expeditionary wars, we're off fighting terrorism and regimes offshore where we're sending an expeditionary force. I'm talking about a war that involves mainland Australia. Then our electronic systems will be amongst the first victims. How do you scale to that? How do you create a war footing in a time of peace and a mentality that says you need to design this stuff to be protected against an aggressive and really talented state adversary? We've never got to that point. Never got to it when I was in government. Haven't got to it since I'm out of government. And I will continue to push. And to your question, yeah, I'm passionate about this. At a macro level, from a sort of a political, sort of economic point of view, and I'm passionate at an individual's point of view. To your listeners, if I had one thing to say to them, I'd say what you do online matters, which might sound like a crazy message to them. Your behaviour online matters as much as your behaviour offline. And somehow we've created this weird distinction. Oh, well, I'm doing it online versus I'm doing it offline. And the reality is, those two are commingled to the point. It's not, you often still hear people, and it saddens me 20-something years into this campaign that I've been trying to run about trying to get people to understand this. They talk about the real world and what happens online. And the online world's just as real. In fact, it's commingled with our life to the point where you frankly can't distinguish between them. In other words, your actions online matter as much as your actions offline. And we've built our society, an amazing, proud society, on our offline actions and those behaviours, we've got to transfer that online. And weirdly, if we did that and we started understanding the consequences of the failures of these things online, then we'd probably get to that national security thing of what if. That's a very long answer to a very simple question.
No, but I think I heard you say, I'll finish with this because I did hear you say 5 years ago, which is the complete contradiction. The internet is net benefit better than it is, more positive than it is negative. And I just wanted to ask, do you still think that? It might have even been longer ago that you made that comment because what's there to be like?
So there are huge efficiencies, right? There's economic efficiencies that come with connecting up. You don't have to have a technician drive around and inspect every single little point. These SCADA systems, these are the on-off switches essentially of industry. This operational technology, connecting it up is amazing. You can have one worker on at home logging in from their laptop to check what the dam is doing, right? And the water sampling stations. That's perfect when it works. It's a bit scary when it fails, and it has failed in other parts of the world, right? And malignantly so. So, there's huge efficiencies that come with that, which lead to economic and social advantages. And the concept of how we can debate, in its heyday, I think it was quite amazing. If you're asking me now, would I like to go back to a totally connected world? Sadly, the answer is probably yes. And I know that will get derision from people. I think the way we now interact with each other, look at all the social and mental health problems coming up in Australian youth, that's got to be connected to the rise of essentially the smartphone. Every study will show that. But I'm not a sort of like wind the clock back guy. We are where we're at. Sorry if I sound contradictory. We're here, right?
Yeah.
We're here in whatever year it is, 2025, and we've got to get on with it. And there's never a better day to start doing the right thing than today. And the right thing today is to start looking at these technologies completely differently to what we've done, sadly, for the last 20-something years as they became hugely consumer-orientated. And I'm convinced at some stage we will. I don't think it'll be during my working life, sadly. And you mentioned sort of the passion I have, and I am super passionate about this. I see one of my obligations is to try to get other people excited about this so that when I'm long gone, there are others that have picked that up and gone, yep, I get it. And I'm going to be the one that creates change. I'm probably not going to be one that solves this. I've come to terms with that as someone in their mid-50s and whose working career you can always see the end of, right? I mean, who are the next people that are going to carry that flame and actually achieve these meaningful changes that I think are just so desperately necessary? And one day when people wake up and they find this technology not working, it's too late to start worrying about that.
Yeah. You just hope it never happens.
It will happen.
But it will.
Yeah, 100%.
I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks as always for listening to Newsmakers. If you liked what you heard, if you learnt something, please leave a review on your podcast app. Maybe even recommend the episode to your network, teammates, family, colleagues. And I should also add, I also send a Newsmakers newsletter each week alongside this episode, which means you'll never miss when one drops. You can subscribe at thesquiz.com.au, and also it's worth noting all these episodes are available to watch on YouTube. Links to everything are in your show notes. Until next week.